Chapter 9. How they brought the bad news from Arago to Quincapa, and what action was taken thereupon. Just as Lord Anthony Boleyn turned into the grand boulevards from the Faubourg Montmartre, Akbar Pasha was leaving them. The Turk did not see the genially flourished cane. He was preoccupied, and perhaps he did not wish to be recognised, for he dodged among the obscure and dangerous streets of the belly of Paris, with many a look behind him. To be sure, this is but a reasonable precaution in a district so favourable to Apache activities. At last he came out into the great open square of the markets, and crossing obliquely came to a drinking den of the type which seeks to attract foreigners, preferably Americans. It bore the quite incongruous name, Au Pierre Tranquille. Akbar mounted the stairs. It was too early for revellers. Even the musicians had not arrived, but an old man sat in one corner of the room sipping a concoction of gin, whisky and rum, which goes in certain circles by the name of a Nantucket cocktail. This individual was of some 60 years of age. His hair and beard were white, his dress was that of a professional man, and he endeavoured to give dignity to his appearance by the assumption of a certain paternal or even patriarchal manner. But his eye was pale and cold as a murderer's, shifty and furtive as a thief's. His hands trembled continually with a kind of palsy, and the white knuckles told a tale of gout. Self-indulgence had bloated his body, and unhealthy fat was everywhere upon him. The trembling of his hands seemed in sympathy with that of his mind. One would have said that he was in deadly fear, or the prey to a consuming anxiety. At the Turk's entrance he rose clumsily, then fell back into his chair. He was more than half intoxicated. Akbar took the chair opposite to him. "We couldn't get it," he said in a whisper, though there was nobody within earshot. "Oh, Dr. Bellick, do try to understand. It was impossible. We tried all sorts of ways." The doctor's voice had a soft suavity. Though a licensed physician, he had long since abandoned legitimate practice, and under the guise of homeopathy pursued various courses which would have been but ill regarded by more regular practitioners. His reply was horrible, uttered as it was in feline falseness, like a caress. "You foul ass," he said. "I have to take this up with SRMD, you know. What will he say? And do." "I tell you I couldn't. There was an old man there who spoilt everything in my idea." "An old man?" Mr Bellick almost dropped his hypocritical bedside voice in his rage. Oh, curse it all!" He leant over to the Turk, caught his beard, and deliberately pulled it. There is no grosser insult that you can offer to a Mussulman, but Akbar accepted it without resentment. Yet so savage was the assault that a sharp cry of pain escaped him. "You dog, you Turkish swine!" hissed Bellick. "Do you know what has happened? SRMD sent a watcher, a bit of himself. Do you understand what that means, you piece of dirt? And it hasn't returned. It must have been killed, but we can't find out how, and SRMD is lying half dead in his house. You pig, why didn't you come with your story at once? I know now what is wrong." "You know, I don't know your address," said the Turk humbly. "Please, oh please leave go of my beard." Bellick contemptuously released his victim, who was a brave enough man in an ordinary way, and would have had the blood of his own sultan, though he knew that the guards would cut him to pieces within the next 10 seconds, for the least of such words as had been addressed to him. But Bellick was his superior in the Black Lodge, which rules by terror and by torture. Its first principle was to enslave its members. The bully Bellick became a whimpering cur at the slightest glance of the dreaded SRMD. "Tell me what the old man was like," he said. "Did you get his name?" "Yes," said Akbar, "I got that. It was Simon If." Bellick dashed his glass upon the ground. "Oh hell, oh hell, oh hell," he said, not so much as a curse, but as an invocation. "Hear, oh hear this creature, the ignorant blind swine. You had him, under your hand. Oh hell, you fool, you fool." "I felt sure he was somebody," said Akbar, "but I had no orders." "And no brains, snarled the other. "Look here, I'll tell you how to get your step in the lodge if you give me £100. "Do you mean it?" cried Akbar, entirely his own man in a moment, for abject fear and obsessing ambition combined to make his advancement the tyrant of his whole tormented mind. "Will you swear it?" Bellick made an ugly face. "By the Black Sow's udder I will." His whole frame trembling with excitement, Akbar Pasha drew a cheque-book from his pocket and filled in a blank for the required sum. Bellick snatched it greedily. "This is worth your money," he said. "That man If is in the 2nd grade, perhaps even the 1st of their dirty order, and we sometimes think he's the most powerful of the whole damn crew. That fool Gray's a child to him. I know now how the watch was destroyed. Ah, SRMD will pay somebody for this. But listen, man, you bring that old beast's head on a charger, or Gray's either, and you can have any grade you dare ask for. And that's no lie, curse it. Why," he went on with increasing vehemence, "the whole thing's a plant of ours. Monarch Knott's one of us. We use him to blackmail Lavinia King, about all he's fit for, the prig, and we got him to drag that Dago woman in front of Master Grey Dog's nose. And now they bring in Simon If. Oh, it's too much. We've even lost their trowel. 10 to 1 they're safe in their abbey tonight. Be off. No, wait for me here. I'll bring back orders. And while I'm gone, get that son of yours here. He's got more sense than you. We'll have to trace Grey somehow, and the astral watchers won't do the trick when Simon If's about." Bellick rose to his feet, buttoned his coat around him, put on a tall silk hat, and was gone without wasting another word upon his subordinate. The Turk would have given his ears to have dared to follow him. The mystery of SRMD's personality and abode was shrouded in the blackest secrecy. Akbar had but the vaguest ideas of the man. He was a formless ideal of terrific power and knowledge, a sort of incarnated Satan, the epitome of successful iniquity. The episode of the watch had not diminished the chief's prestige in his eyes. It was evidently an accident. SRMD had sent out a patrol, and it had been ambushed by a whole division, as it were. So trivial a regrettable incident was negligibly normal. Akbar had no thought but of SRMD as a being infinitely great in himself. He had no concept of the price paid by the members of the Black Lodge. The truth is that as it intimates advance, their power and knowledge becomes enormously greater, but such progress is not a mark of general growth, as it is in the case of the White Brotherhood. It is like a cancer which indeed grows apace, but at the expense of the man on whom it feeds, and will destroy both him and itself in the long run. The process may be slow, it may extend over a series of incarnations, but it is sure enough. The analogy of the cancer is a close one, for the man knows his doom, suffers continual torture, but to this is added the horrible delusion that if only the disease can be induced to advance far enough, all is saved. Then he hugs the fearful growth, cherishes it as his one dearest possession, stimulates it by every means in his power, yet all the time he nurses in his heart an agonizing certainty that this is the way of death. Bellick knew SRMD well, had known him for years. He hoped to supplant him, and while he feared him with hideous and unmanly fear, hated him with most hellish hatred. He was under no delusion as to the nature of the path of the Black Lodge. Akbar Pasha, a mere outsider, without a crime on his hands as yet, was a rich and honoured officer in the service of the Sultan. He, Bellick, was an ill-reputed doctor, living on the fears of old maids, on doubtful and even criminal services to foolish people, from the supply of morphia to the suppression of the evidence of scandal, and on the harvest of half-disgusted blackmail that goes with such pursuits. But he was respectability itself compared to SRMD. This man, who called himself the Count MacGregor of Glenlyon, was in reality a Hampshire man of lowland Scottish extraction, of the name of Douglas. He had been well educated, became a good scholar, and developed an astounding taste and capacity for magic. For some time he had kept straight, then he had fallen, chosen the wrong path. His powers had increased at a bound, but they were solely used for base ends. He had established the Black Lodge far more firmly than ever before, jockeyed his seniors out of office by superior villainy, and proceeded to forge the whole weapon to his own liking. He had had one terrible setback. Cyril Grey, when only 20 years of age, a freelance magician, had entered the lodge, for it worked to attract innocent people under a false pretence of wisdom and of virtue. Cyril, discovering the trick, had not withdrawn. He had played the game of the lodge, and made himself Douglas's right-hand man. This being achieved, he had suddenly put a match to the arsenal. The lodge was always seething with hate. Theosophists themselves might have taken lessons from this exponent, and the result of Cyril's intervention had been to disintegrate the entire structure. Douglas found his prestige gone, and his income with it. Addiction to drink, which had accompanied his magical fall, now became an all-absorbing vice. He was never able to rebuild his lodge on its former lines, but those who thirsted for knowledge and power, and these he still possessed in ever-increasing abundance as he himself decayed, clung to him, hating and envying him, as a young ruffian of the streets will envy the fame of some robber or murderer who happens to fill the public eye. It was with this clot of perverse feelings that Bellick approached the Rue Quincampoix, one of the lowest streets in Paris, and turned in at the den where Douglas lodged. SRMD was lying on a torn, soiled sofa, his face white as death, a mottled and empurpled nose still showing trace of its original aggressive and haughty model, alone made for colour. For his eyes were even paler than the doctor's. In his hand was a bottle half full of raw whisky, with which he was seeking to restore his vitality. "I brought you some whisky," said Bellick, who knew the way to favour. "Put it down over there. You've got some money?" Bellick did not dare to lie. SRMD had spotted the fact without a word. "Only a cheque. You shall have half tomorrow when I've cashed it. Come here at noon." Despite the obvious degradation of his whole being, SRMD was still somebody. He was a wreck, but he was the wreck of something indubitably big. He had not only the habit of command, but the tone of fine manners. In his palmy days he had associated with some very highly placed people. It was said that the 3rd section of the Russian Police Bureau had once found a use for him. "Is the Countess at home?" asked Bellick, apparently in courtesy. "She's on the boulevard. Where else should she be at this time of night?" It was the vilest thing charged against that vile parody of a man, his treatment of his wife, a young, beautiful, talented and charming girl, the sister of a famous professor at the Sorbonne. He had delighted to reduce her to the bedraggled street-walker that she now was. Nobody knew what Douglas did with his money. The contributions of his lodge were large. Blackmail and his wife's earnings aided the exchequer. He had probably a dozen other sources of income. Yet he never extricated himself from his sordidness, and he was always in need of money. It was no feigned need either, for he was sometimes short of whisky. The man's knowledge of the minds of others was uncanny. He read Bellick at a gesture. "Grey never struck the watcher," he said. "It was not his style. Who was it?" "Simon If." "I shall see to that." Bellick understood that, though SRMD feared If and loathed him, his great preoccupation was with Cyril Grey. He hated the young magician with a perfect hatred. He would never forget his ruin at these boyish hands. Also he forgave nothing. From a kindness to an insult, he was malignant for the sake of malice. "They will have gone over to their house on Montmartre," continued Douglas, in a voice of absolute certitude. "We must have the exits watched by Abul Bey and his men. But I know what Grey will do as well, as if he has told me. He will bolt somewhere warm for his damned honeymoon. You and Akbar watch the Gare de Lyon. Now look here, with a bit of luck, we'll finish off this game. I'm weary of it, mark me well." Douglas rose. The whisky he had drunk was impotent to affect him, head or legs. He went over to a small table on which was painted certain curious figures. He took a saucer, poured some whisky into it, and dropped a 5-franc piece into the middle. Then he began to make weird gestures and to utter a long conjuration, harsh-sounding and apparently in gibberish. Lastly he set fire to the whisky in the saucer. When it was nearly bent through, he blew it out. He took the coin, wrapped it in a piece of dark red silk, and gave it to his pupil. "When Grey boards the train," he ordered, "go up to the engine-driver, give him this, and tell him to drive carefully. Let me know what the fellow looks like. Get his name if you can. Say you want to drink his health, then come straight here in a cab." Bellick nodded. The type of magic proposed was familiar enough to him. He took the coin and made off. At the sign of the Tranquil Father, Akbar was awaiting him with his son Abdul Bey. The latter was in charge of the Turkish secret service in Paris, and he did not hesitate to use the facilities at his disposal to his own magical advancement. All his resources were constantly at the service of Bellick. Now that SRMD himself was employing him, he was beside himself with pride and pleasure. Bellick gave his instructions. An hour later, the house where Lisa was even then undergoing her ordeal would be surrounded by spies. Additional men would be placed at all the big terminals of Paris, for Abdul Bey meant to do the thing thoroughly. He would not take a chance. For all his fanatical faith in Douglas, he thought it prudent to provide against the possibility of an error in the chief's occult calculations. Also, his action would prove his zeal. Besides, Cyril might deliberately lay a false trail, was almost sure to play some trick of the sort. Bellick and Akbar Pasha were stationed in a restaurant facing the Gare de Lyon, ready to answer the telephone at any moment. "Now," said Abdul, "have you photographs of these people to show my men?" Bellick produced them. "I've seen this man Grey somewhere," remarked the young Turk casually, and then he gave a sudden and terrible cry. In Lisa he recognised an unknown woman whom he had admired the year before at a dance, and whom he had craved ever since. "Tell SRMD," he roared, "that I'm in this thing for life or death, but I asked the girl for a trophy." "You'll get that, or anything else," said Bellick, "if you can put an end to the activities of Mr Cyril Grey." Abdul Bey rushed off without another word spoken, and Bellick and the Pasha went to the rendezvous appointed. They passed that night and the next day in alternate bouts of drink and sleep. About 8:30 on the following evening the telephone rang. Douglas had judged rightly. The lovers had arrived at the Gare de Lyon. Bellick and his pupil sprang to life, fresh and vigorous at the prick of the summons to action. It was easy to mark the tall figure of the magician with the lovely girl upon his arm. At the barrier their distinction touched the humanity of the collector. Tickets through to Rome and no luggage, most evidently an elopement. With romantic sympathy the kind man determined to propose the passage of Bellick, whom he supposed to be an angry father or an outraged husband, but the manner of the Englishman disarmed him. Besides, he had a ticket to Dijon. Concealing himself as best as he could, the doctor walked rapidly to the head of the train. There, assuming the character of a timid old man, he implored the driver with the gift of the bewitched cartwheel to be sure to drive carefully. He would drink the good fellow's health, to be sure. What name? "Oh, Marcel Dufour." "Of the furnace, that is appropriate," laughed the genial passenger, apparently reassured as to his security. But he did not enter the train. He dashed out of the station and into a motor cab, overjoyed to return to Douglas with so clean a record of work accomplished. He never gave the Turk another thought. But Akbar Pasha had had an idea. Bellick had taken a ticket for Dijon. He would take one too, and he would go. He would retrieve his error of yesterday. He was not in the least afraid of that cub Grey, when Simon If was not there to back him. It would go hard, but he should get a drop of Lisa's blood, if he had to bribe the wagon-knit man. Then, who knows, there might even be a chance to kill Grey. He waited till the last moment before he boarded the train. The train would stop at Moret-les-Sablons. By that time the beds would be made up. He would have plenty of time to act. He would go on to Rome if necessary. Cyril Grey, away from the influence of Simon If, had become the sarcastic sphinx once more. He was wearing a travelling suit with knickerbockers, but he still affected the ultra-pontifical diplomatist. "The upholstery of these cars is revolting," he said to Lisa with a glance of disgust, and he suddenly opened the door away from the platform and lifted her onto the permanent way, thence into a stuffy compartment in the train that was standing at the next foyer. "A frosty moonlit night like this," he said, pulling a large black pipe from his pocket and filling it, "indicates, for romantic lovers like ourselves, the propriety of a descent at Moret by a similar route in a day or so, and the pursuance of our journey to Naples. See Naples and die," he added musingly, "decidedly a superior programme." Lisa would have listened to a proposition to begin their travels by swimming the Seine, on the ground that the day after tomorrow would be Friday, so she raised no objection, but she could not help saying that they would have reached Moret more quickly by the rapide. "My infant child," he returned, "the celebrated Latin poet Quintus Horatius Flacius has observed, for our edification and behoof, Festina lente, hasten slowly." This epigram has been translated by a famous Spanish author. Mañana Dante adds his testimony to truth in his grandiose outburst, Domine. Also an Arab philosopher, whom I personally revere, remarks, if we may trust the assertion of Sir Richard Francis Burton, KCMG, and why should we not? "Conceal thy tenants, thy treasure, and thy travelling. This I do more so," he concluded cryptically, "than you imagine." They were still waiting for their local funeral, which the French grandiloquently describe as a train, to start when Dr. Bellick returned radiant to the Rue Quincampoix. Douglas was on the alert to receive him. The news took only a second to communicate. "Marcel Dufour," cried SRMD, "we shall drink for him as he may not drink on duty." He carefully opened 2 bottles of whisky, mixed the stale spirit in the magic saucer with their contents, and bade Bellick join him at the table. "Your very good health, Marcel Dufour," cried Douglas, "and mind you drive carefully." Bellick and he now set to work to steadily drain the 2 bottles, a stiff nip every minute, but the stuff had no effect on them. It was far otherwise with the man on the engine. Almost before he had well left Paris behind him, he began to fret about the furnace, and told his fireman to keep up the fullest head of steam. At Milan the train should have slackened speed. Instead it increased it. The signalman at Fontainebleau was amazed to see the rapide rush through the station 8 minutes ahead of time, against the signals. He saw the driver grappling with the fireman, who was thrown from the footplate a moment after, but escaped with a broken leg. "My mate went suddenly mad," the injured man explained later. "He held up a 5-franc piece which some old gentleman had given him, and swore that the devil had promised him another if he made it to Dijon in 2 hours. And as you know, it is 5. What horror!" He grew afraid, saw the signal set at danger, and sprang to the lever. Then that poor crazed Dufour had thrown him off the train. The guard was new to that section of the line, and so, no doubt, too timid to take the initiative. He certainly should have applied the brakes even at Milan. An hour later, Cyril Grey and Lisa and all their fellow passengers were turned out at Fontainebleau. There had been a terrible disaster to the Paris-Rome rapide at Moret. The line would be blocked all night. "This contretemps," said Cyril, as if he had heard of a change of programme at a theatre, "will add appreciably to the length, and may I add to the romance, of our proposed walk." When they reached Moret more than 3 hours later, they found the rapide inextricably tangled with a heavy freight train. It left the line at the curve and crashed into the slower train. Cyril Grey still had a surprise in store. He produced a paper of some sort from his pocket, which the officer of the police cordon received in the manner of the infant Samuel when overwhelmed by the gift of prophecy. He made way for them with proud deference. They had not to walk far before the magician found what he was seeking. Beneath the ruins of the rear compartment were the remains of the late Akbar Pasha. "I wonder how that happened," he said. "However, here is a guess as your epitaph. A little learning is a dangerous thing. I think, Lisa, that we should sup at the Cheval Blanc before we start our walk to Barbizon. It is a long way, especially at night, and we want to cut away to the west so as to avoid Fontainebleau for the sake of the romance of the thing." Lisa did not mind whether she supped at the White Horse or on one. She realized that she had hold of a man of strength, wisdom, and foresight, far more than a match for their enemies. He stopped to speak to the officer in charge of the cordon as they passed him. Among the dead, Mr and Mrs Cyril Grey, English people, no flowers, service of the minister. The officer promised to record the lie officially. His deference was amazing. Lisa perceived that her lover had been at the pains to arm himself with more than one kind of weapon. Lisa pressed his arm and murmured her appreciation of his cleverness. "It won't deceive Douglas for 2 minutes, if he be, as I suspect, the immediate hound of the Baskervilles, but he may waste some time rejoicing over my being such an ass as to try it, and that's always a gain." Lisa began to wonder whether her best chance of ever saying the right thing would not be to choose the wrong. His point of view was always around the corner of her street. Chapter 10. How they gathered the silk with the weaving of the butterfly neck. Cyril Grey made the midnight invocation to the sun god Kefra, the winged beetle, upon the crest of the long rocker, and he made the morning invocation to the sun god Ra, the hawk, upon the heights that overlooked the hamlet of Babizon. Thence, like Chanticleer himself, he woke the people of the inn, who, in memory of the days Stevenson had spent with them, honour his ashes by emulating the morality of Long John Silver. They were prepared for the breakfast order, but Cyril's requirement, a long-distant calls to Paris, struck them as unseasonable and calculated to disturb the balance of the Republic. They asked themselves if the Dreyfus case would come again. However, Cyril got his call and Simon Iffy's information before 7 o'clock, long before Douglas, who had waited until midnight for the news of his triumph, had recovered from the sleep following its celebration. If in his fastest automobile had picked up the lovers at an agreed spot in the forest, the Croc de Grand Martre, whirled them to Dijon and put them into the train for Marseille. There they took ship and came to Naples by sea without adventure. The enemy, in one way or another, had been thrown utterly off the track. It was early in the morning when they landed. At 3 o'clock they had visited such local deities as commanded their most urgent piety, the museum, Virgil's tomb, also Michelson, the bookseller and vendor of images of the ineffable. At 4 they started hand in hand along the shore towards their new home. An hour's walk brought them to the foot of a long stairway, damp stone walk, narrow between high walls, that led vertical and steep to the very crest of Posilipio. One could see the old church amid its cluster of houses. Cyril pointed to a house a couple of 100 yards north of the church. It was the most attractive building on the hillside. The house itself was not large, but it was built like a toy imitation of one of those old castles that one sees everywhere on difficult heights, throughout most of southern and even central Europe. In a word, like a castle in a fairy story. It looked from below, owing to foreshortening, as if it were built over a sheer rampart, like the Potala at Lhasa. But this was only the effect of merging a series of walls which divided the garden by terraces. "Is that the butterfly net?" cried Lisa, slapping her hands with delight. "That," he dissented, "is the net." Once again Lisa felt a pang of something like distrust. His trick of saying the simplest things as if they bore a second meaning, hidden from her, annoyed her. He had been strangely silent on the voyage, and wholly aloof from her on those plains where she most needed him. That was a necessary condition of the experiment, of course, but none the less it tended to disturb her happiness. Such talks as they had had were either purely educative, magic in 6 easy lessons, he called it magic without tears, or else they were conventional lovers' chats which she felt sure he despised. He would tell her that her eyes were like the stars, and she would think that he meant, "What am I to say to this piece of wood?" Even nature seemed to stir his contempt in some way. One night she had noticed him wrapped in a poetic trance, leaning over the bows, watching the foam. For a long while he remained motionless, his breast rising quickly and falling, his lips trembling with passion, and then he turned to her and said in cold blood, "Ought that to be used to advertise a dentifrice or a shaving soap?" She was sure that he had rehearsed the whole scene merely to work her up in order to have the fun of dropping her again. Only the next morning she woke early to find a pencilled sonnet on his table, a poem so spiritual, so profound, and of such dual craft that she knew why the few people whom he had allowed to read his work thought him the match of Milton. So apt were the similes that there could be no doubt that he had thought it out line by line, in that trance which he had marred for her by his brutal anticlimax. She had asked him about it. "Some people," he said quite seriously, "have one brain. Some have two. I have two." A minute later, "Oh, I forgot. Some have none." She had refused to be snubbed. "What do you mean by your having two brains?" "I really have. It seems as if, in order to grasp anything, I were obliged to take its extremes. I see both the sublime and the ridiculous at once, and I can't imagine one existing apart from the other, any more than you can have a stick with only one end. So I use one point of view to overbalance the other, like a child starting to swing itself. I'm never happy until I've identified an idea with its opposite. I take the idea of murder, just a plain, horrid idea. But I don't stop there. I multiply that murder and intensify it a millionfold, and then a millionfold again. Suddenly, one comes out into the sublime idea of the opening of the eye of Shiva, when the universe is annihilated in an instant. Then I swing back and make the whole thing comic by having the hero chloroform Shiva in the nick of time, so that he can marry the beautiful American heiress. Until I've been all round the clock like that, I don't feel that I had the idea at all. If you'd only let me go on about the shaving soap, I should have made it into something lovely again, and all the time I should have perceived the absolute identity of even the two contradictory phases. But it was beyond her still, in each case as it came up. That is the net, a riddle. It might mean 1,000 things, and to a woman of her positive and prosaic temperament, which she had for all her hysteria and romanticism, doubt was torture. Love itself always torments women of this type. They want their lovers under lock and key. They would like love itself to be a more substantial commodity, a thing that one could buy by the pound and store in a safe or an ice chest. Doubt and jealousy, these other handmaidens of love, are also the children of imagination. But people wrongly use the word imagination to mean abstraction of ideas from concrete facts. And this is the reverse of the truth. Imagination makes ideas visible, clothes being in form. It is, in short, very much like the faith of which Paul speaks. When true imagination makes true images of the unseen, we have true love and all true gods. When false imagination makes false images, then come the idols, Moloch, Jahve, Jagannatha, and their kindred, attended by all shapes of vice, of crime, of misery. Lisa was thinking as she climbed the apparently unending staircase that she had taken pretty long odds. She had not hesitated to buck the tiger life. Simon If had warned her that she was acting on impulse, but on the top of that, he had merely urged her to be true to it. She swore once more that she would stick to her guns. The black mood fell from her. She turned and looked upon the sea, now far below. The sun, a hollow orb of molten glory, hung quivering in the midst of the Mediterranean, and Lisa entered for a moment into a perfect peace of spirit. She became one with nature, instead of a being eternally at war with it. But Cyril turned his face again to the mountain. She knew that he wanted to perform the evening adoration from the terrace of the house itself. At last they came out from their narrow gangway to the by-street behind the church. It was an old and neglected thoroughfare, far from the main automobile road that runs along the crest. It was a place that the centuries had forgotten. Lisa realized that it was a haven of calm, and in a sense she resented the fact. Her highly coloured nature demanded constant stimulus. She was an emotion fiend, if one may construct the term by analogy with another branch of pathology. The lovers turned to the left through the village. In a few minutes the road opened, and they saw the villa before them. It stood on a spur of rock, separated from the main hill by a sharply cut chasm. This was spanned by an old stone bridge, a flying arch set steeply from the road to the house. It almost gave the effect of a frozen cascade issuing from the great doorway. Cyril led Lisa across the bridge. This house was not served like that they had left behind them in Paris. Visitors were not expected or desired at any time, and the inmates rarely left the grounds except on duty. It was therefore some time before an answer to the summons reached them. Cyril's hand, dragging down an iron rope, set swinging a great bell, deep and solemn, like a tocsin, in the turret which overlooked the chasm. Not until its last echo was dumb did a small Judas in the door slide back. Cyril held up his left hand and showed his seal ring. Immediately the door swung open. A man of 50-odd years of age, dressed in black, with a great sword, like his brother guard at the professed house in Paris, stood bowing before them. "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." I entered the house. With these words Cyril Grey assumed possession. "Lead me to Sister Clara." The man turned and went before them down a long corridor which opened upon a stone terrace flagged with porphyry. A circular fountain in the middle had, for its centre, a copy of the Venus Callipyge in black marble. The parapet was decorated with statues of satyrs, fauns, and nymphs. The woman who came to meet them was assuredly kin to that ancient company. She was about 40 years of age, robust and hardy, burnt dark with years of outdoor life, her face slightly pitted with smallpox, her eyes black, stern, and true. Her whole aspect and demeanour expressed devotion, capacity, and determination. It was she who ruled the house in the absence of Simon If. A brief colloquy between this woman and Cyril Grey followed their first greetings, whose austere formality inexplicably conveyed the most cordial kindness. He explained that he wished her to continue in full control of the house, only modifying its rules so far as might be necessary for the success of a certain experiment in magic which he had come to carry out. Sister Clara acquiesced with the slightest of nods. Then she raised her voice and summoned the others to the evening adoration of the sun. Cyril performed this as leader. The duty done, he was free to meet his new brothers and sisters. Sister Clara was assisted by 2 young women, both of the slender willowy type, rather babyish, even one might say, with their light brown fluffiness and their full red soft lips. They remained standing apart from the men, who numbered 5. First in rank came the burly brother Oneofrio, a man of some 35 years, strong as a bull, with every muscle like iron from constant physical toil. 2 men of 30 stood beside him, and behind them 2 lads of about 16. They were all devoted, so far as the outer world was aware, to the healing of humanity in respect of its physical ills. The men were doctors or students, the women nurses, though in fact Sister Clara was herself the most brilliant of them all, a surgeon who could have held her own against any man in Europe. But it was contrary to the rule of the house for any sick person to lodge there. The private hospital which was attached to it was situated some 300 yards further back from the hillside. At a glance Lisa perceived that she had come into a circle where discipline was the first consideration. Everyone moved as if a Prussian sergeant had been in charge of him from infancy. Everyone looked as if his responsibility were ever present to his mind. These manners sat naturally enough about Clara and Oneofrio. On the others the idea was hardly yet assimilated, but there was no evidence of any outward constraint. Even the youngest of the boys was proud to take himself so seriously as he did. A touch of frost was in the air. Cyril led Lisa within. A special set of rooms had been prepared for their reception, but Lisa was displeased to find that they had been arranged entirely with reference to feminine tastes and requirements. A single scheme of colour embraced the whole suite, white, blue, and silver. The tapestries, the carpets, the very ceilings were wholly in these, and no other lights. The pictures and statues were of Artemis, no other goddess. The very objects in the apartment were crescent-shaped, and the only metal in evidence was silver. Where the crescent could not serve the purpose, the surfaces had been engraved with stars of 9 points. Only 3 books lay upon the table. They were the Endymion of Keats, the Atlantia in Caledon of Swinburne, and one other. But in a small bookshelf were several other volumes, and Lisa found later that each one described, suggested, or had been more or less directly inspired by the moon. In a silver censer, too, burned an incense whose predominating ingredients were camphor. Everything present was designed or chosen so that it might turn the girl's mind to the Earth's satellite. Subsequently, she discovered that this plan extended even to her diet. She was to live exclusively on those foods which wise men of old classified as lunar in nature, on account either of their inherent qualities or because they are traditionally sacred to Diana. After the beginning of the experiment, no male was to enter that apartment. She was a little frightened on grasping the fact that Cyril must have foreseen her perfect compliance from the beginning. He noticed it with a slow smile, and began to explain to her why he had chosen the moon as the type of butterfly they were going to snare. "The moon is the most powerful influence in your horoscope," he said. "She stands in her own sign Cancer in the mid-heaven. The sun and Mercury are rising in square to her, which is not specially good. It may bring trouble of a certain kind. But Neptune is sextile to her, Jupiter and Venus trine. It is about as good a horoscope as one could hope for in such a case. The worst danger is the conjunction of Luna and Uranus. They are much too close to be comfortable. My own nativity goes well with yours, for I am primarily solar by nature, though, heaven knows, Herschel in the ascendant modifies it, and so I make the compliment to you. But I am not to influence you or associate with you too much. I shall sleep with the men in the square tower yonder, which is kept magically separate from the rest of the house. We shall all be working constantly to invoke the moon's influence and to keep off intruders. Sister Clara is egregiously powerful in work of this special kind. She has made a particular study of it for 20 years, and during the past 10 she had never spoken to a man except in strict necessity. Her pupils have taken a similar resolution. There is no question of vows, which implies self-distrust, fear of weakness and of vacillation. The women of our order execute their own wills with no need of external pressure. Go thou and do likewise." Suddenly he had become stern and gloomy, and she felt how terrible would be his anger or contempt. The morning broke brilliant, and Lisa found, not for the first time, that the most bracing influence resulted from the routine peculiar to the professed houses. To rise before dawn, to make a ceremonial ablution with the intention of so purifying both mind and body that they should be as it were new-born. Then the joyous outburst of adoration as the sun rose to sight. This was the true opening of the day. Insensibly the years slipped from her. She became like a maiden in thought and in activity. About a week was to elapse before the new moon, at the moment of which the operation was timed to commence, but it was a busy week for Cyril Grey. With brother Onofrio, for whom he had taken immense liking, he inspected every inch of the defences of the house. It was already a kind of fortress. The terraces were bounded by ramparts angled or rounded so as to suggest that old-fashioned pattern of military work of which Fort William in Calcutta is said to be the most perfect example. But in the defence of which the magicians were thinking was of a different order. The problem was to convert the whole place as it stood into an impregnable magical circle. For years, of course, the place had been defended, but not as against its present dangers. It had been hitherto sufficient to exclude evil and ignorant beings, things of the same class as Douglas's Watcher, but now a far more formidable problem was in view: how to dissuade a soul, a being armed with the imperial right to enter, from approaching. Demons and elementals and intelligences were only fractions of true entities, according to the theory. They were illusions, things merely three-dimensional, with no core of substance in themselves. In yet another figure, they were adjectives and not nouns. But a human soul is a complete reality. Every man and every woman is a star. To repel one such from its demand to issue into the world of matter was a serious difficulty, and also possibly involved no mean responsibility. However, Cyril's main hope was that any passing souls would be reasonable and not try to force themselves into uncongenial company or plant themselves in unsuitable soil. He had always held that incarnation was balked when the soul discovered that the hereditary and environment of the embryo it had chosen were too hostile to allow the desired manifestation. The soul would then withdraw, with the physical result of miscarriage, stillbirth, or, where the embryo, deserted by the human soul, becomes open to the obsession of some other thing, such as a vampire, or what the Bible calls a dumb spirit, the production of monsters or idiots. Cyril Grey, by insisting upon constant devotion to the human ideal, hoped to ward off all other types of soul, just as the presence of a pack of wolves would frighten away a lamb, and he further trusted to attract potent forces, who would serve as a kind of lighthouse to his harbour. He imagined his desire moon soul afloat in space, vehemently spurred towards the choir of sympathetic intelligences whom it could hardly fail to perceive, by reason of the intensity of the concentration of the magical forces of the operators upon the human idea. 2 days before the beginning of the operation, a telegram from Paris reached him. It stated that, as he suspected, Bellick and Douglas were the forces behind the attack. Further, that Grey's presence in Naples was known, and that 3 members of the Black Lodge had left Paris for Italy. He thought it undesirable to communicate the news to Lisa, but he renewed his general warnings to her. "Child," he said, "you are now ready for our great experiment. On Monday, the day of the new moon, you take the oath of dedication, and we shall be able to resume those relations which we temporarily renounced. Now let me say to you that you are absolutely guarded in every way but one. The weak spot is this. We cannot abolish unsuitable thoughts entirely from your mind. It is for you to do that, and we have done our best to make the conditions as favourable as possible. But I warn you that the struggle may be bitter. You will be amazed at the possibilities of your own mind, its fertility of cunning, its fatally false logic, its power of blinding you to facts that ought to be as clear as daylight. Yes, even to the things before your very eyes. It will seek to bewilder you, to make you lose your mental balance. Every trick is possible. And you will be so beaten and so blind that you have only one safeguard, which is to adhere desperately to the literal terms of your oath. Do that, and in a little while the mind will clear. You will understand what empty phantoms they were that assailed you. But if you fail, your only standard is gone. The waters will swirl about you and carry you away to the abyss of madness. Above all, never distinguish between the spirit and the letter of your oath. The most exquisite deceit of the devil is to lure you from the plain meaning of words. So, though your instinct, and your reason, and your common sense, and your intelligence all urge you to interpret some duty otherwise than in the plain original sense, don't do it. I don't see what you mean. Here's a case. Suppose you swore not to touch alcohol. The devil would come with a sickness and an alcoholic medicine. He would tempt you to say that of course your oath didn't mean medicinally. Or you would wish to rub your skin with eau de cologne. Of course, touch really meant drink. And I should really be right to be stupidly literal like that. Yes, in a case where the mind, being under a magical strain, becomes unfit to judge. It is the story of Bluebeard, only you must alter it so that the contents of the fatal chamber exist only in the women's imagination, that she had so worked herself up by what she thought she might see, that she also thought she saw it. So be on your guard. On the last day of the old moon he gave her an idea of the main programme. First the honeymoon, their normal relations were to endure until there was evidence of the need to emphasise the crucial point of the operation. From that moment she was to see nothing of Cyril save in the ceremonies of invocation. All other relations were to cease. The lover would become the hermit. The magician had calculated the probable moment of incarnation as about 6 months before the day of birth. Once it became certain that the soul had taken possession of the embryo, the hermit would become the elder brother. It was clearly the middle period that was critical, not only because of the magical difficulties, but because Lisa herself would be under intense strain, and isolated from her lover's active sympathy. But Cyril thought it best to dare these dangers rather than to allow his own soul to influence her atmosphere, as his solar personality might possibly drive away the very butterfly which they wished to collect. In fact, his human individuality was one of the things that had to be banished from her neighbourhood. She must know nothing of him but the purely magical side, when clothed in robes suitable to the invocations of Luna, and with word and gesture concentrated wholly upon the work. He sank Cyril Grey utterly in the priest of Artemis. Thy shrine, thy oracle, heat of pale-mouthed prophet dreaming.